Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank the organisers for asking me to come along to this conference and say a few words. What I'll be doing is very briefly skipping through some history of biological weapons. Let's press this button. It works. So basically I'll be discussing some of the early historical examples of the use of disease as a method of warfare, biological warfare. And I'll then briefly talk about some of the efforts to control these weapons through the so-called arms control process, the BWC, the Biological Weapon Convention, which Paul mentioned briefly. And then I'll go on to talk about some of the more recent efforts which have broadened the engagement of other stakeholders in the health community. And that is much more focused on addressing contemporary disease issues, including prevention of disease, whether it be accidental or deliberate, and also having effective disease response strategies, outbreak response strategies. So a bit of history, like poisons, the prohibition of poisons goes back millennia. And back in those days, poisons referred to both chemical weapons, toxic chemicals, and also pathogens. And that included the poisoning of wells with dead bodies, for example. A couple of examples on the next slide, which are more interesting, I guess. One was catapulting plague victims over the walls of a city in Kaffa. And the other one was handing over smallpox-infected blankets to North American Indians as in trade with the British primarily back in those days. And that caused massive casualties amongst the local Indian populations. A lot of conflict between the colonials and the Indians at that stage. And this was a weapon of war against the natives. You've already seen this slide from Paul, but the point I'm making here is that although the chemical and biological weapons have been lumped together historically as poisons, from the early 20th century there's been a distinction between the two in terms of the use of them. So as Paul mentioned, in the First World War, massive amounts of chemical weapons used. The casualty figures, I think, tie in pretty well with Paul's, thank goodness. But there almost no use of pathogens in the First World War. The use that was there was primarily against animals, horses, which of course were military transport, and cattle, which was for food. And again, as Paul mentioned, in the aftermath of the First World War, there was the so-called 1925 Geneva Protocol, which was a prohibition of use of either chemical weapons or biological weapons, but no restriction on their development or stockpiling. And as a consequence of that, the next slide shows some of the violations of that agreement, the 1925 Protocol. You'll note that all except one are chemical weapons. It was only the Japanese force in China which used both chemical weapons and biological weapons between 37 and 45. And just a bit more detail on that. This program weaponised pathogens like anthrax, cholera, typhus, diphtheria and plague. A range of delivery systems. The simplest one was actually just infecting fleas with the plague. A couple of weapon systems. One is the so-called Ishii bomb. That's the in the middle, the diagram. Ishii was the leader of this program, a very clever but very terrible Japanese scientist. And the right-hand side image is actually, this was a simulation. The Japanese were planning to have balloons going across the Pacific Ocean and landing in the US continent. And they did a number of tests with these balloons without the payload. And they fortunately decided not to use live pathogens in such delivery systems. It just goes to show, though, that the different methods which have been used for delivery of these pathogens in warfare. Beyond World War II, both the US and the Soviets continued active BW programs, including spray systems, missiles, rockets, and again using a range of different disease agents, some of them from previously. And the image on the right-hand side of the slide is the Russians developed, well, and US as well, developed submunition systems which were designed to release pathogens more effectively. Like you can imagine that biological materials are fairly unstable with temperature and also the pressure increases. So it turned out the most effective way of delivering these pathogens was to have them inside a plastic ball, submunition, within a delivery system. In the Soviet case, it was intercontinental missile. And that missile system was designed to break open over the target area. These balls about the size of a grapefruit would all drop down. They'd break on impact, they'd bounce a bit, and then the agent would disperse without being affected by either heat or a pressure rise, which would tend to destroy the agent. So a lot of science went into this delivery of agents, of biological agents. Anyway, as a consequence of these developments, in the 60s, the disarmament people in Geneva, the treaty negotiators, initially developed they developed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which was mentioned earlier. They then developed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty back by '68. And then with increasing use of toxic chemicals in Vietnam, and also the increasing weaponisation of pathogens, biological weapons, there was a decision taken to try and have a treaty to prohibit both chemical and biological weapons. This would be a single treaty. And one of the most important documents or reports, reviews, which helped get this opinion internationally was a report undertaken by the World Health Organization. The cover page is there. The report is still very relevant and still very current, despite being almost 50 years old. And so this indicates that even back in those days, there was a strong interaction between the defence community, negotiators of treaties, weapon type issues, and also the World Health Organization in effect in guiding the decision makers and policy makers to prohibit these sorts of weapons. Anyway, so after a couple of years of negotiating, they decided to separate out chemical and biological. So the Biological Weapon Convention, the BWC as I'll call it, was finished in a couple of years. A very short document, essentially prohibitions but no verification. And that was based on the assumption, quote unquote, that BW were not very useful in warfare, so therefore they didn't need to be verified. Unlike chemical weapons, which, as Paul has discussed already, were subject to very stringent verification of destruction after the conclusion of the CLBC in the early 90s and the destruction of chemical weapons under the treaty provisions. And any compliance concern with the BWC was to be referred to the UN Security Council. And of course, as we know, the P5 members of the Security Council have a veto right. So this means that the US or Soviet Union, now Russia, France, UK or China, if they chose to pursue a BW program, if there were complaints against such a program, they could veto that issue being considered by the Security Council. So it was a very sort of bit of a Mickey Mouse way of having a provision for compliance issues. And also, which will become important in my later discussion, unlike the NPT, the nuclear type organisations, the IEA, the CTBT office, unlike the OPCW, which Paul has referred to, there was no organisation to administer the BWC, and is still no organisation of that sort. Okay, so I won't give you a legal lesson of the treaty, but basically the treaty, articles of the treaty, some are more important than others. Article 1 is the prohibition to develop, produce, stockpile these weapons, including the pathogens or the delivery system. Also included is the implicit ban on use of these weapons. If you don't have them, you can't use them, basically. Article 3 is the prohibition of transferring information about the weapons that others can then make use of in producing BW themselves, the non-proliferation type provision, which includes the prohibition of transfers to terrorist groups, which will become more important down the track and also later in my presentation. Article 4, each state party has to have national laws in place to criminalise the prohibitions under the BWC. Article 7, a provision on assisting states parties which have been attacked or threatened with attack by biological weapons. And Article 10, which is very long, but essentially it discusses international cooperation to share information on biology for peaceful purposes. And that takes about 100 or so words to say that there, but that's essentially what Article 10 is all about. Okay, so a major challenge in the BWC, including its implementation, is the so-called dual-use dilemma. And this issue really is the fact that well, I'll go to the next slide. The types of materials, the seed cultures for pathogens, the equipment, the fermenters, centrifuges for purifying, freeze dryers for forming powders from these pathogens and so on, and the technology and so on can be used for both public good, in other words, public health, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, but the same technology, materials and equipment can also be used for making biological weapons. And this is the biological weapons also terrorism use of pathogens as well. And this is a real challenge to get this convention working effectively to stop the spread of biological weapons without inhibiting the peaceful use of biology for good purposes. And this has been something which the treaty implementers have been grappling with ever since the treaty was entered into force in 1975. Anyway, so moving on 15 years from the entry into force in 75, there'd been major advances in biology since the mid-70s, which are obviously still going on at the moment. One of the main advances is the gene technology, genetic modification. These days, there's all these sorts of genomics, gene editing and so on, which again can be used for highly beneficial medical purposes, among other purposes, but also can be used for making pathogens as warfare agents. As I mentioned, there's no effective verification of this treaty. In the late 1970s, there was an outbreak of anthrax at Sverdlovsk, which is a former Soviet military base, and that turned out to be a military BW factory. And also, as you'll remember, Iraq got involved in trying to produce biological weapons as well in the late 80s. So because of these various factors, it led to a decision that the BWC was weak and needed to be strengthened along the arms control process. And I'll just show a couple of slides which indicate those examples. Sverdlovsk, a bit hard to see on the slide, basically a military facility producing anthrax for weapon purposes. Between two shifts, they replaced the filters, but they didn't filters to stop the anthrax powder being released to the open air. They didn't replace the filters properly, so there was a release of anthrax to the air. Luckily, the wind was blowing away from the city of Sverdlovsk, so only fairly minor casualties. 100 or so people died, probably a few hundred affected by anthrax, but could have been so much worse if the wind had been blowing towards the city centre. And that was denied at the time by the Soviets. They said no, the anthrax was caused by tainted meat, not by inhalation of anthrax spores. It wasn't until there were defectors, Pasechnik and Alabek, in the late 80s, which confirmed that was definitely a military site producing BW with anthrax spores. And Yeltsin, once he took charge of the country in the early 90s, admitted there had been a program. In the case of Iraq, their main active program was chemical weapons, as Paul has mentioned. They also tried to make biological weapons in a facility called Al-Hakim in the middle of the desert. They tried to weaponise anthrax and a few other agents. And the right-hand bottom image is essentially the so-called R-40 rockets, which was sort of a dual purpose, bomb, R-40 bombs, dual purpose. They were used for both white phosphorus as a signalling type device, but they also could be used for both chemical weapon release and also pathogen release. And that photograph was taken by UNSCOM people when they were destroying the weapons in the early 90s. Okay, so anyway, so as I mentioned, there seemed to be a need to strengthen the BWC. They chose the arms control process. They tried to mimic the provisions of the Chemical Weapon Convention, in other words, declarations of relevant facilities, dual-use facilities, high containment facilities producing, handling things like viruses in risk group 4, bacteria and so on in risk group 3. They developed a system of routine visits, or tried to develop a system of routine visits, inspections of those facilities to check everything was above board. And that process took place from 1995 until about 2001. I happened to be there for most of it, and that's why my hair's gone white. It was a very difficult process, and eventually, that's just what I've just said. In addition to routine visits or inspections, also a challenge inspection regime was developed, and also field investigations for alleged use of BW. And just as there's an organisation for the prohibition of chemical weapons, part of this treaty process, part of the protocol provision, was to include an organisation for the prohibition of biological weapons, an OPBW. Now, none of this happened. We developed a rolling text, a draft treaty, in August 2001. This wasn't long after George Bush II came to office. Washington decided it didn't want this protocol, so it basically shafted it. And then after that, there was a different process commenced called the intersessional process. And this was a process which commenced in 2003, which consisted of meetings of experts and also meetings of diplomats, 2 meetings a year, to basically consider how the treaty itself could be improved by more effective implementation. So it moved away from trying to verify to a process of trying to assist states parties of the treaty to have their provisions more effectively implemented at a national level. And I'll discuss that as we go. But by this time, of course, there'd been increasing concerns about bioterrorism, which wasn't new in 2001. One of the early examples which people refer to was the use of salmonella in salad food bars in Oregon in '84. And this was done by the Rajneeshi, I'm not very good at saying that, Rajneeshi sect. And they basically wanted to rig the local elections, so they poisoned these salad bars with salmonella in about 10 salad bars within the voting area, hoping enough people would get sick so they wouldn't be voting, which would enable their candidates to be elected by their own people who wouldn't be at that salad bar, those salad bars. And as I say in the slide, about 700 odd people were injured from food poisoning. None died, thank goodness, but this is a very early example of bioterrorism. Paul's mentioned the use of sarin by the Om Shinrikyo sect in March of '95. The Om Shinrikyo sect also tried to produce and release anthrax. And the bottom photograph in this slide, you can probably see fairly well. It shows a great big circular vat on top of the building with steam coming out of it, steam or smoke, or mixture of both maybe. The sect tried to produce and release anthrax from the top of that building. Fortunately, they failed miserably on that one. They used a very weak anthrax strain for a start. What they produced was very impure, and they couldn't aerosolise it. So basically, the liquid slurry sort of flowed down the side of the building and caused a terrible smell, as you might expect. And the complaint from neighbours was from the smell, not from the fact that there was a pathogen being released. A very lucky escape from those nearby. Had it been done properly, it would have been a disaster. And of course, as we all know, I'm not sure which one's my glass. As we all remember, 9/11 was closely followed by the anthrax letters in the US. A disgruntled scientist who worked at one of the major US biodefence facilities sent these letters containing anthrax to a number of senators and other people. The anthrax, very fine particles, were actually spread initially in the postal mail service where they sort letters, puffed the envelopes, and a lot of postal workers were affected. And also the addressees got a bit of a shock to realise that they'd been sent anthrax in the mail. And this really sort of following so close from the 9/11 terrorist event at the Twin Towers really galvanised international opinion to do something about bioterrorism. So basically, obviously a lot of discussion about how to prevent bioterrorism, and these are some of the ways that pathogens could be obtained by a terrorist, either an individual or a terrorist group. And so there seemed to be need to tighten up the security of facilities and individuals who handle these sorts of materials. One result of this was a UN Security Council resolution 1540, and this applied to both nuclear materials, toxic chemicals, and also pathogens and toxins. And this basically required all UN member states to develop measures nationally to ensure that all their nuclear materials, which would be relevant to a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb, all toxic chemicals which could be used as a chemical device, and all pathogens which were certainly risk group 3 and risk group 4, had appropriate protection and measures in place to avoid them being obtained by terrorist entities. So that was sort of a security arms control type approach, which applied to all members of the UN, not just members of a treaty. There'd also been, going back to the early 80s, a mechanism developed by the UN Secretary General to investigate alleged use of either chemical or biological weapons. This method was used initially in the Iraq-Iran war in the 80s, and by the early 2000s there was much more focus on using this mechanism for alleged use of biological weapons. So in the last decade or thereabouts there's been the strengthening of this mechanism with new inspectors being trained with specialisation in biology, pathogens, new labs being trained which are dealing normally with high-risk pathogens. So if there is actually a biological event, a team can go in under the direction of the UN Secretary General, collect samples, interview casualties, medical people on the ground, take samples, have the samples analysed at a nearby specialist laboratory and determine whether it was actually a pathogen being used, and if so, whether it may have been a deliberate attack or perhaps a natural outbreak for some other reason. Okay, so this sort of brings us to, I guess, BWC Mark II, if you like, and that really is the point that, as you can see from that spectrum, starting off on the left-hand side, the green side going to the red side, disease can occur, or disease outbreaks can occur for a range of reasons. Everything from a natural outbreak of disease, accidents, perhaps from a university lab or from a high containment facility, negligence, through to the deliberate use of BW, which could either be a state program, like during warfare, or else deliberate use by a terrorist entity. And obviously, the same types of emergency response is required irrespective of how the disease is caused. Like if you've got an outbreak of anthrax in a certain location, you need to have the same sorts of emergency response, the same sorts of measures to separate casualties from non-casualties, the same sorts of medical countermeasures, same sorts of hospital support and so on, whether it's deliberate or whether it's accidental or whether it's a natural outbreak. This applies also, of course, to other types of pathogens and disease outbreaks as well. So it became clear from the early 2000s that there was an even stronger link between the BWC and the other health organisations, WHO, etc., than had been previously recognised. And so this really became very clear and very important to what became this BWC intersessional process, this meeting of experts in mid-year, a meeting of diplomats at the end of each year since 2003. And so there were 6 major themes. I won't read them out, but basically the importance of implementing the convention, making sure all states have got criminal laws in place, the importance of regional cooperation, because one of the sayings which was being used at the time, and was still being used, is disease knows no borders, no boundaries, so that if you've got adjacent countries, if one country has a disease outbreak, depending on a number of factors, including the way the disease is spread, the met conditions, transport arrangements, transport systems and so on, it's not long before adjacent countries are also affected. And of course, if air transport's involved, then many countries can be affected very shortly, as happened in the SARS, for example, in some years ago. So these are some of the themes of that intersessional process, including assistance in the case of alleged use of BW. And as I mentioned, this drew in many other agencies, not just the BWC people themselves. So this is a list of the agencies which have become very much involved with this intersessional process, ranging from the FAO, the ISRC, of course, in their emergency support in all sorts of emergency type situations. Interpol became involved with the law enforcement aspect of use of pathogens for hostile purposes, and so on. The OPCW was involved, at least in part because toxins are covered by both BWC and CWC, so use of toxins would involve people from both treaty regimes, WHO obviously, and also the OIE. So this became very much a process of sharing knowledge between those organisations, sharing information and working together to try and prevent the occurrence of disease outbreaks. And if disease outbreaks did occur, working together to try and minimise the impact of the disease outbreak by containing as far as possible the location of the outbreak, reducing the risk of individuals transporting the disease elsewhere and so on. And again, the World Health Organization has played a key role in this whole process. And these are just 3 of the publications produced by the World Health Organization in this early stage of this intersessional process. Between about 2003 and 2006, they produced the Public Health Response, which in effect was the second edition of the earlier report I mentioned from the late 60s. And and also manuals and guidelines on biosafety and biosecurity. And these manuals and the World Health Organization individuals who came to the meetings and supported the work were crucial in getting these provisions accepted and adopted by states parties of the BWC. Now, I'm almost end of my time, so I'm not going to go into these slides in much detail. I'll skip through very quickly, but obviously I'll take any questions afterwards if you've got any questions on them. But clearly there's a distinction between biosafety and biosecurity, although there is a common area as well. This is just the obvious biosecurity type measures need to be taken, including training is very important of personnel in the facility, and also codes of conduct. International cooperation is very important. In the slide here, I'll talk about increasing capacity building to both prevent the disease outbreak in the first place and also to minimise the outcomes if there is a disease outbreak. Once again, outreach education, a message from Ban Ki-moon when he was UN Secretary General. And this essentially became the theme of this whole process. You can't have diplomats and biological weapon experts solve the problem. The problem requires input and solid support from a range of actors, including the agencies I've mentioned earlier, and including also academia, people from the biotech industry, research institutions, and others which have got an interest in stopping disease outbreaks. I haven't mentioned yet, there's also a large involvement by different scientific societies, including the British Royal Society, US National Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Science, both in reviewing advances in science relevant to BWC and also helping us develop methods to review the science effectively so that states parties can be advised of when developments occur which need to be taken into account in how to implement the treaty. Like if there's a new virus developed, for example, there'd be guidance to make sure all states parties were aware of that and make sure it had proper containment if it was going to be used within those states parties, for example. Codes of conduct. Despite the fact that bioterrorism reached headline proportions in 2001 onwards with the anthrax letters, most scientists don't actually know about the BWC. They don't know the fact that there's prohibitions in BWC. They don't know there are criminal offences if you violate those prohibitions, in particular produce BW or use it. So there's been a process through academia, through various societies, to try and raise awareness of the fact that there is this treaty, the BWC, and try and develop within scientific communities an awareness of the treaty and have them develop a culture of responsibility when handling these dangerous pathogens and toxins. And this is ongoing. It's getting some traction, but it's a very slow process. Going back to 2005, we came up with the concept of layers of codes, like the Hippocratic Oath type code for medical people could also be applicable as a universal code for biological scientists. Elements of codes in scientific society codes and also workplace codes where individuals in a workplace are obliged to have very strict rules on how to handle and use these pathogens. So just a few concluding comments. The process, this interstitial process has worked, I think, remarkably well, much better than we thought it might. I've already mentioned the number of relationships between the BWC community and broader health agencies, which is critical for the effectiveness of this whole venture. Many actions are in progress. Very useful activities in terms of both prevention activities as well as response strategies, sharing between countries, sharing information, sharing materials and equipment, and so on. And a lot of these approaches have been done through very informal approaches, like people go to Geneva in a hall, probably half the size of this hall, maybe nearly the size of this hall, and the hall's full. But often the most useful discussions take place in the coffee bar next door, where a few people from perhaps a lab in a certain country start talking to another scientist somewhere else, and they develop a program together to try and support the objectives I've outlined in this presentation. But there's much to be done. I'm getting a bit over it, but just very briefly, the requirements of the convention haven't been very well met by all states parties. A number of states which have joined the treaty, for example, haven't criminalised the prohibitions in the treaty. And that means there are gaps in implementation. It means that if an individual in one country produces a pathogen, he may not be able to be charged in that country under criminal law. So these are very important steps as part of the whole process of preventing production of BW. Another issue was the resource issue. Now, we've already heard about the CTBT office, which I think is a few hundred people from memory. A few hundred people in the CTBT office.
How many people? How many staff?
CTBT? Yeah, 300.
300, yeah, I was pretty close. There's also 2,000 staff in the IEA. OPSW has got about 500 staff. Well, that's down to about 400 now because the number of inspectors have been finished their duty because of the fact that they're approaching completion of destruction. BWC has principally 3 staff members who support the organisation in Geneva, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. One of the reasons why the process hasn't gone better is because there just aren't enough people in Geneva working for the BWC as full-time jobs to help these processes get traction, helping organise meetings, providing support to various states as they develop legislation, biosafety, biosecurity measures. So this is a major deficiency in the whole BWC process. Hopefully it will be remedied down the track, but I'm not holding my breath at the moment. Just a few of the comments which are made, which are very relevant to this process. There was a tendency initially for some of the Western countries in this process to try and push their views onto other developing countries. It very soon became apparent that no one size fits all. In other words, what works fine in the US doesn't necessarily work well in a small developing country. So each country needs to tailor its own solution to its own particular infrastructure, its own requirements, whether it's got facilities having pathogens or not, its legal system and so on and so on. And obviously in the whole process there's a need to maximise the synergies and avoid duplication between the various organisations I've mentioned. There's also in the last few years a global health security agenda which has been developed. Clearly there's common interest between the GHSA and BWC core business. So I imagine there'll be interaction between that agenda and the BWC agenda as time goes on. That's it. So thank you very much.